Do you feel a shiver up your spine from fear? Yes, it's another story from the Nightshade diary. You know what that means. Check under the bed and make sure no one or nothing is there. Is the closet door securely shut? Then leave your disbelief behind. Amp up your imagination and hang on tight for another ride into terror and mystery. And like all good horror stories, just imagine it's a dark and stormy night. And remember, screaming like a little girl is permitted. The King of the Cats by Stephen Vincent Benet. But my dear, said Mrs. Colvin with a tiny gasp, you can't actually mean a tail. Mrs. Dingle nodded impressively. Exactly. I've seen him twice. Paris, of course, and then a command appearance at Rome. We were in the royal box. He conducted, my dear. You've never heard such effects from an orchestra. And my dear, she hesitated slightly, he conducted with it. How perfectly, fascinatingly, too horrid for words, said Mrs. Colvin in a dazed but greedy voice. We must have him to dinner as soon as he comes over. He is coming over, isn't he? The 12th, said Mrs. Dingle with a gleam in her eyes. The new symphony people have asked him to be guest conductor for 3 special concerts. I do hope you can dine with us some night while he's here. He'll be very busy, of course, but he's promised to give us what time he can spare. Oh, thank you, dear, said Mrs. Colvin, abstractedly, her last read upon Mrs. Dingle's pet British novelist still fresh in her mind. You're always so delightfully hospitable, but you mustn't wear yourself out. The rest of us must do our part. I know Henry and myself would be only too glad to. That's very sweet of you, darling. Mrs. Dingle also remembered the larceny of the British novelist. But we're just going to give Monsieur Thibault. Sweet name, isn't it? They say he's descended from the Thibault in Romeo and Juliet, and that's why he doesn't like Shakespeare. We're just going to give Monsieur Thibault the simplest sort of time. A little reception after his first concert, perhaps. He hates, she looked around the table, large mixed parties. And then, of course, his little idiosyncrasy. She coughed delicately. It makes him feel a trifle shy with strangers. But I don't understand yet, Aunt Emily, said Tommy Brooks, Mrs. Dingle's nephew. Do you really mean this Thibault bozo has a tail, like a monkey and everything? Tommy dear, said Mrs. Colvin crushingly, in the first place, Monsieur Thibault is not a bozo. He is a very distinguished musician, the finest conductor in Europe. And in the second place, he has, Mrs. Dingle was firm, he has a tail. He conducts with it. Oh, but honestly, said Tommy, his ears pinkening, I mean, of course, if you say so, Aunt Emily, I'm sure he has. But still, it sounds pretty steep if you know what I mean. How about it, Professor Tato? Professor Tato cleared his throat. Tick, he said, putting his fingertips together curiously. I shall be very anxious to see this Monsieur Thibault for myself. I've never observed a genuine specimen of Homo caudatus, so I should be inclined to doubt. And yet, in the Middle Ages, for instance, the belief in men tailed or with caudipal appendages of some sort was both widespread and, as far as we can gather, well-founded. As late as the 18th century, a Dutch sea captain, with some character for veracity, recounts the discovery of a pair of such creatures in the island of Formosa. They were in a low state of civilization, I believe, but the appendages in question were quite distinct. And in 1860, Dr. Grimbrook, the English surgeon, claims to have treated no less than 3 African natives with short but evident tails, though his testimony rests upon his unsupported word. After all, the thing is not impossible, though doubtless unusual. Web feet, rudimentary gills, these occur with some frequency. The appendix we have always with us. The chain of our descent from the ape-like form is by no means complete. For that matter, he beamed around the table, what can we call the last few vertebrae of the normal spine, but the beginnings of a concealed and rudimentary tail? Oh yes, yes, it's quite possible that in an extraordinary case, a reversion to type, a survival though, of course, I told you so, said Mrs. Dingle triumphantly. Isn't it fascinating? Isn't it, Princess? The Princess Vivekananda's eyes, blue as a field of larkspur, fathomless as the center of heaven, rested slightly for a moment on Mrs. Dingle's excited countenance. Very fascinating, she said, in a voice like stroked golden velvet. I should like, I should like very much to meet this Monsieur Thibault. Well, I hope he breaks his neck, said Tommy Brooks under his breath. But nobody ever paid much attention to Tommy. Nevertheless, at that time, for Mr. Thibault's arrival in these states drew nearer and nearer, people in general began to wonder whether the princess had spoken quite truthfully, for there was no doubt of the fact that, up till then, she had been the unique sensation of the season. And you know what social lions and lionesses are. It was, if you remember, a Siamese season, and genuine Siamese were at quite as much of a premium as Russian accents had been in the quaint old days when the show Seurat was a novelty. The Siamese Art Theater, imported at terrific expense, was playing a packed house. Gushgutsu, an epic novel of Siamese farm life in 19 closely printed volumes, had just been awarded the Nobel Prize. Prominent pet and newt dealers reported no cessation in the appalling demand for Siamese cats, and upon the crest of this wave of interest in things Siamese, the Princess Vivekananda, poised with the elegant nonchalance of a Hawaiian water baby upon its surfboard, she was indispensable. She was incomparable. She was everywhere. Youthful, enormously wealthy, allied on one hand to the royal family of Siam, and on the other to the Cabots, and yet, with the first 18 of her 21 years shrouded from speculation in a golden zone of mystery. The mingling of races in her had produced an exotic beauty, as distinguished as it was strange. She moved with feline, effortless grace, and her skin was as if it had been gently powdered with tiny grains of the purest gold. Yet the blueness of her eyes, set just a trifle slantingly, was as pure and startling as the sea on the rocks of Maine. Her brown hair fell to her knees. She had been offered extraordinary sums by the Master Barbers' Protective Association to have it shingled, straight as a waterfall tumbling over brown rocks. It had a vague perfume of sandalwood and suave spices, and held tints of rust and the sun. She did not talk very much, but then she did not have to. Her voice had an odd, small, melodious huskiness that haunted the mind. She lived alone and was reputed to be very lazy. At least it was known that she slept during most of the day. But at night she bloomed like a moonflower, and a depth came into her eyes. It was no wonder that Tommy Brooks fell in love with her. The wonder was that she let him. There was nothing exotic or distinguished about Tommy. He was just one of those pleasant, normal young men who seemed created to carry on the bond business by reading the newspapers in the university club during most of the day, and could be relied upon at night to fill an unexpected hole in a dinner party. It is true that the princess could hardly be said to do more than tolerate any of her suitors. No one had ever seen those aloofly arrogant eyes enliven at the entrance of any male. But she seemed to be able to tolerate Tommy a little more than the rest, and that young man's infatuated daydreams were beginning to be beset by smart solitaires and imaginary apartments on Park Avenue when the famous M. Thibault conducted his first concert at Carnegie Hall. Tommy Brooks sat beside the princess. The eyes he turned upon her were eyes of longing and love, but her face was impassive as a mask. The only remark she made during the preliminary bustlings was that there seemed to be a number of people in the audience. But Tommy was relieved, if anything, to find her even a little more aloof than usual, for ever since Mrs. Colverin's dinner party, a vague disquiet as to the possible impression which this Thibault creature might make upon her had been growing in his mind. It shows his devotion that he was present at all. To a man whose simple, Princetonian nature found in just a little love, a little kiss, the quintessence of musical art, the average symphony was a positive torture, and he looked forward to the evening's program itself with a grim, brave smile. "Shh!" said Mrs. Dingle breathlessly. "He's coming." It seemed to the startled Tommy as if he were suddenly back in the trenches under a heavy barrage as M. Thibault made his entrance, to a perfect bombardment of applause. Then the enthusiastic noise was sliced off in the middle, and a gasp took its place. A vast, windy sigh, as if every person in that multitude had suddenly said, "Ah!" For the papers had not lied about him. The tale was there. They called him theatric, but how well he understood the uses of theatricalism. Dressed in unrelieved black from head to foot, the black dress shirt had been a special token of Mussolini's esteem. He did not walk on. He strolled leisurely, easily, aloofly, the famous tail curled nonchalantly about one wrist. A suave black panther, lounging through a summer garden with that little mysterious weave of the head that panthers have when they pad behind bars. The glittering darkness of his eyes unmoved by any surprise or elation. He nodded twice in regal acknowledgment as the clapping reached an apogee of frenzy. To Tommy there was something dreadfully reminiscent of the princess in the way he nodded. Then he turned to his orchestra. A second and louder gasp went up from the audience at this point, for as he turned the tip of that incredible tail twine with dainty carelessness into some hidden pocket and produced a black baton. But Tommy did not even notice. He was looking at the princess instead. She hadn't even bothered to clap at first, but now he had never seen her move like this, never. She was not applauding. Her hands were clasped in her lap, but her whole body was rigid, rigid as a steel bar, and the blue flowers of her eyes were bent upon the figure of Monsieur Thibault in a terrible concentration. The pose of her entire figure was so still and intense that for an instant Tommy had the lunatic idea that at any moment she might leap from her seat beside him as lightly as a moth and land with no sound at Monsieur Thibault's side to, yes, to rub her proud head against his coat in worship. Even Mrs. Dingle would notice in a moment. "Princess," he said in a horrified whisper. "Princess." Slowly the tenseness of her body relaxed. Her eyes veiled again. She grew calm. "Yes, Tommy?" she said in her usual voice, but there was still something about her. "Nothing, only—" "Oh, hang." "He's starting," said Tommy, as Monsieur Thibault, his hands loosely clasped before him, turned and faced the audience. His eyes dropped. His tail twitched once impressively, then gave three little preliminary taps with his baton on the floor. Seldom has Gluck's overture to Iphigenie in Aulis received such an ovation, but it was not until the Eighth Symphony that the hysteria of the audience created its climax. Never before had the new symphony played so superbly, and certainly never before had it been led with such genius. Three prominent conductors in the audience were sobbing with a despairing admiration of envious children toward the close, and one at least was heard to offer wildly $10,000 to a well-known facial surgeon there present for a shred of evidence that tales of some variety could by any stretch of science be grafted upon a normally decade form. There was no doubt about it. No mortal hand and arm, be they ever so dexterous, could combine the delicate elan and powerful grace displayed in every gesture of Monsieur Thibault's tail. A sable staff, it dominated the brasses like a flicker of black lightning, an ebon, elusive whip. It drew the last exquisite breath of melody from the woodwinds and ruled the stormy strings like a magician's rod. Monsieur Thibault bowed and bowed again. Roar after roar of frenzied admiration shook the hall to its foundation, and when he finally staggered, exhausted from the platform, the president of the Wednesday Sonata Club was only restrained by force from flinging her $90,000 string of pearls after him in an excess of aesthetic appreciation. New York had come and seen, and New York was conquered. Mrs. Dingle was immediately besieged by reporters, and Tommy Brooks looked forward to the little party at which he was to meet the new hero of the hour, with feelings only a little less lugubrious than those that would have come to him just before taking his seat in the electric chair. The meeting between his princess and Monsieur Thibault was worse and better than he expected. Better because, after all, they did not say much to each other, and worse because it seemed to him somehow that some curious kinship of mind between them made words unnecessary. They were certainly the most distinguished-looking couple in the room, as he bent over her hand. "So daringly foreign, both of them, and yet so different," babbled Mrs. Dingle, but Tommy couldn't agree. They were different, yes. the dark, lithe stranger with the bizarre appendage tucked carelessly in his pocket, and the blue-eyed, brown-haired girl. But that difference only accentuated what they had in common. Something in the way they moved, in the suavity of their gestures and the set of their eyes. Something deeper even than race. He tried to puzzle it out. Then, looking around at the others, he had a flash of revelation. It was as if that couple were foreign indeed, not only to New York, but to all common humanity. As if they were polite guests from a different star. Tommy did not have a very happy evening on the whole, but his mind worked slowly, and it was not until much later that the mad suspicion came upon him in full force. Perhaps he is not to be blamed for his lack of immediate comprehension. The next few weeks were weeks of bewildered misery for him. It was not that the princess's attitude toward him had changed. She was just as tolerant of him as before, but Monsieur Thibault was always there. He had a faculty of appearing, as out of thin air. He walked, for all his height, as lightly as a butterfly, and Tommy grew to hate the faintest shuffle on the carpet that announced his presence. And then, hang it all, the man was so smooth, so infernally, unruffably smooth. He was never out of temper, never embarrassed. He treated Tommy with the extreme of urbanity, and yet his eyes mocked deep down, and Tommy could do nothing. And gradually the princess became more and more drawn to the stranger, in a soundless communion that found little need for speech. And that, too, Tommy saw and hated, and that, too, he could not mend. He began to be haunted, not only by Monsieur Thibault in the flesh, but by Monsieur Thibault in the spirit. He slept badly, and when he slept, he dreamt of Monsieur Thibault, a man no longer, but a shadow, a spectre, the limber ghost of an animal whose words came purringly between sharp little pointed teeth. There was certainly something odd about the whole shape of the fellow, his fluid ease, the mold of his head, even the cut of his fingernails. But just what it was escaped Tommy's intensest cogitation, and when he put his finger on it at length, at first he refused to believe. A pair of petty incidents decided him, finally against all reason. He had gone to Mrs. Dingle's one winter afternoon, hoping to find the princess. She was out with his aunt, but was expected back for tea, and he wandered idly into the library to wait. He was just about to switch on the lights, for the library was always dark even in summer, when he heard a sound of light breathing that seemed to come from the leather couch in the corner. He approached it cautiously and dimly made out the form of Monsieur Thibault, curled up on the couch, peacefully asleep. The sight annoyed Tommy, so that he swore under his breath, and was back near the door on his way out, when the feeling we all know and hate, the feeling that eyes we cannot see are watching us, arrested him. He turned back. Monsieur Thibault had not moved a muscle of his body to all appearance, but his eyes were open now, and those eyes were black and human no longer. They were green. Tommy could have sworn it, and he could have sworn that they had no bottom, and gleamed like little emeralds in the dark. It only lasted a moment, for Tommy pressed the light button automatically, and there was Monsieur Thibault, his normal self, yawning, a little but urbanely apologetic, but it gave Tommy time to think. Nor did what happened a trifle later increase his peace of mind. They had lit a fire, and were talking in front of it. By now Tommy hated Monsieur Thibault so thoroughly that he felt that odd yearning for his company that often occurs in such cases. Monsieur Thibault was telling some anecdote, and Tommy was hating him worse than ever for basking with such obvious enjoyment in the heat of the flames and the ripple of his own voice. Then they heard the street door open, and Monsieur Thibault jumped up, and jumping caught one sock on a sharp corner of the brass fire rail, tore it open in a jagged flap. Tommy looked down mechanically at the tear. A second's glance, but enough, forced Monsieur Thibault for the first time, and Tommy's experience, lost his temper completely. He swore violently in some spitting foreign tongue. His face distorted suddenly. He clapped his hand over his sock. Then, glaring furiously at Tommy, he fairly sprang from the room, and Tommy could hear him scaling the stairs in long, agile bounds. Tommy sank into a chair, careless for once of the fact that he heard the princess's light laugh in the hall. He didn't want to see the princess. He didn't want to see anybody. There had been something revealed when Monsieur Thibault had torn that hole in his sock, and it was not the skin of a man. Tommy had caught a glimpse of black plush, black velvet, and then had come Monsieur Thibault's sudden explosion of fury. Good Lord, did the man wear black velvet stockings under his ordinary socks? Or could he? But here Tommy held his fevered head in his hands. He went to Professor Tato that evening with a series of hypothetical questions. But as he did not dare confide his real suspicions to the professor, the hypothetical answers he received served only to confuse him the more. Then he thought of Billy Strange. Billy was a good sort, and his mind had a turn for the bizarre. Billy might be able to help. He couldn't get hold of Billy for 3 days and lived through the interval in a fever of impatience. But finally they had dinner together at Billy's apartment, where his queer books were, and Tommy was able to blurt out the whole disordered jumble of his suspicions. Billy listened without interrupting until Tommy was quite through. Then he pulled at his pipe. "But my dear man," he said protestingly. "Oh, I know," said Tommy, and waved his hands. "I know I'm crazy. You needn't tell me that. But I tell you, the man's a cat all the same. No, I don't see how he could be, but he is. Why, hang it. In the first place, everybody knows he's got a tail." "Even so," said Billy, puffing. "Oh, my dear Tommy, I don't doubt you saw or think you saw something. Everything you say, but even so," he shook his head. "But what about those other birds, werewolves and things?" said Tommy. Billy looked dubious. "Well," he admitted, "you've got me there, of course. At least a tailed man is possible. And the yarns about werewolves go far enough. So that, well, I wouldn't say there aren't or haven't been werewolves, but then I'm willing to believe more things than most people. But a werecat? Or a man that's a cat? And a cat that's a man? Honestly, Tommy, if I don't get some real advice, I'll go clean off my hinge. For heaven's sake, tell me something to do." "Let me think," said Billy. "First, you're pizzin sure this man is a cat?" "Yeah," said Tommy, nodded violently. "Check. And second, if it doesn't hurt your feelings, Tommy, you're afraid this girl you're in love with has at least a streak of felinity in her? And so she's drawn to him?" "Oh, Lord, Billy, if I only knew." "Well, I suppose she really is too. Would you still be keen on her?" "I'd marry her if she turned into a dragon every Wednesday," said Tommy fervently. Billy smiled. He said. "Then the obvious thing to do is to get rid of this Monsieur Thibault. Let me think." He thought about 2 pipes full, while Tommy sat on pins and needles. Then finally he burst out laughing. "What's so darn funny?" said Tommy aggrievedly. "Nothing, Tommy. Only I've just thought of a stunt. Something so blooming crazy. But if he is, what you think he is, it might work." And going to the bookcase, he took down a book. "If you think you're going to quiet my nerves by reading me a bedtime story, shut up, Tommy, and listen to this. If you really want to get rid of your feline friend." "What is it?" "Book of Agnes Repplier's, about cats. Listen. There is also a Scandinavian version of the ever famous story which Sir Walter Scott told to Washington Irving, which Monk Lewis told to Shelley, and which in one form or another we find embodied in the folklore of every land. Now, Tommy, pay attention. The story of the traveler who saw within a ruined abbey a procession of cats lowering into a grave a little coffin with a crown upon it. Filled with horror, he hastened from the spot, but when he had reached his destination, he could not forbear relating to a friend the wonder he had seen. Scarcely had the tale been told, when his friend's cat, who lay curled up tranquilly by the fire, sprang to its feet, cried out, 'Then I am the king of the cats!' and disappeared in a flash up the chimney." "Well?" said Billy, shutting the book. "By gum!" said Tommy, staring. "By gum, do you think there's a chance?" "I think we're both in the booby hatch. But if you want to try it, try it. I'll spring it on him the next time I see him. But, listen, I can't make it a ruined abbey." "Oh, use your imagination. Make it Central Park, anywhere. Tell it as if it happened to you. Seeing the funeral procession and all that. You can lead into it somehow, let's see. Some general line. Oh, yes. Strange, isn't it, how facts often copies fiction? Why, only yesterday..." See? Strange, isn't it? How fact so often copies fiction, repeated Tommy dutifully. Why, only yesterday I happened to be strolling through Central Park when I saw something very odd. I happened to be strolling through. Here, give me that book, said Tommy. I want to learn the rest of it by heart. Mrs. Dingle's farewell dinner to the famous Monsieur Thibault on the occasion of his departure for his western tour was looked forward to with greatest expectations. Not only would everybody be there, including the Princess Vivra Canarda, but Mrs. Dingle, a hinter if there ever was one, had let it be known that at this dinner an announcement of very unusual interest to society might be made. So everyone for once was almost on time, except for Tommy. He was at least 15 minutes early, for he wanted to have speech with his aunt alone. Unfortunately, however, he had hardly taken off his overcoat when she was whispering some news in his ear so rapidly that he found it difficult to understand a word of it. And you mustn't breathe it to a soul, she ended, beaming. That is, not before the announcement. I think we'll have that with a salad. People never pay very much attention to salad. Breathe what, Aunt Emily, said Tommy, confused. The princess, darling. The dear princess and Monsieur Thibault. They just got engaged this afternoon, dear things. Isn't it fascinating? Yeah, said Tommy, and started to walk blindly through the nearest door. His aunt restrained him. Not there, dear. Not in the library. You can congratulate them later. They're just having a sweet little moment alone there now. And as she turned away to Harry the butler, leaving Tommy stunned. But his chin came up after a moment. He wasn't beaten yet. Strange, isn't it? How often fact copies fiction, he repeated to himself, in dull mnemonics. And as he did so, he shook his fist at the library door. Mrs. Dingle was wrong as usual. The princess and Monsieur Thibault were not in the library. They were in the conservatory, as Tommy discovered when he wandered aimlessly past the glass doors. He didn't mean to look, and after a second he turned away. But that second was enough. Thibault was seated in a chair, and she was crouched on a stool at his side, while his hand softly, smoothly stroked her brown hair. Black cat and Siamese kitten. Her face was hidden from Tommy, but he could see Thibault's face, and he could hear. They were not talking, but there was a sound between them, a warm and contented sound like the murmur of giant bees in a hollow tree. A golden musical rumble, deep-throated, that came from Thibault's lips, was answered by hers, a golden purr. Tommy found himself back in the drawing-room, shaking hands with Mrs. Colvin, who said frankly that she had seldom seen him look so pale. The first two courses of the dinner passed Tommy like dreams, but Mrs. Dingle's cellar was notable, and by the middle of the meat course he began to come to himself. He had only one resolve now. For the next few moments he tried desperately to break into the conversation, but Mrs. Dingle was talking, and even Gabriel will have a time interrupting Mrs. Dingle. At last, though, she paused for breath, and Tommy saw his chance. Speaking of that, said Tommy, piercingly, without knowing in the least what he was referring to. Speaking of that. As I was saying, said Professor Tato, but Tommy would not yield. The plates were taken away. It was time for salad. Speaking of that, he said again, so loudly and strangely that Mrs. Colvin jumped, and an awkward hush fell over the table. Strange, isn't it, how often fact copies fiction? There he was started. His voice rose even higher. Why, only today I was strolling through, and word for word he repeated his lesson. He could see Thibault's eyes glowing at him as he described the funeral. He could see the princess tense. He could not have said what he had expected might happen when he came to the end, but it was not bored silence, everywhere to be followed by Mrs. Dingle's acrid, Well, Tommy, is that quite all? He slumped back in his chair, sick at heart. He was a fool, and his last resource had failed. Dimly heard his aunt's voice saying, Well then, and realized that she was about to make the fatal announcement. But just then Monsieur Thibault spoke. One moment, Mrs. Dingle, he said with extreme politeness, and she was silent. He turned to Tommy. You are positive, I suppose, of what you saw this afternoon, Brooks? He said in tones of light mockery. Absolutely, said Tommy sullenly. Do you think I'd... Oh, no, 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 Monsieur Thibault waved the implication aside, but such an interesting story. One likes to be sure of the details, and of course you are sure, quite sure, that the kind of crown you described was on the coffin? Of course, said Tommy, wondering, but then I'm the king of the cats, cried Monsieur Thibault in a voice of thunder, and even as he cried it, the house lights blinked. There was the soft thud of an explosion. It seemed muffled in cotton wool from the minstrel gallery, and the scene was lit for a second by an obliterating and painful burst of light that vanished in an instant and was succeeded by heavy blinding clouds of white pungent smoke. Oh, those horrid photographers, came Mrs. Dingle's voice in a melodious wail. I told them not to take the flashlight picture till dinner was over, and now they've taken it just as I was nibbling lettuce. Someone tittered a little nervously. Someone coughed. Then gradually the veils of smoke dislimned and the green and black spots in front of Tommy's eyes died away. They were blinking at each other like people who have just come out of a cave into brilliant sun. Even yet their eyes stung with the fierceness of that abrupt illumination, and Tommy found it hard to make out the faces across the table from him. Mrs. Dingle took command of the half-blinded company with her accustomed poise. She rose, glass in hand. And now, dear friends, she said in a clear voice, I'm sure all of us are very happy to... Then she stopped, open-mouthed, an expression of incredulous horror in her features. The lifted glass began to spill its contents on the tablecloth in a little stream of amber. As she spoke, she had turned directly to Monsieur Thibault's place at the table, and Monsieur Thibault was no longer there. Some say there was a bursting flash of fire that disappeared up the chimney. Some say it was a giant cat that leaped through the window at a bound without breaking the glass. Professor Tato puts it down to a mysterious chemical disturbance operating only over Monsieur Thibault's chair. The butler, who is pious, believes the devil in person flew away with him, and Mrs. Dingle hesitates between witchcraft and a malicious ectoplasm dematerializing on the wrong cosmic plane. But be that as it may, one thing is certain. In the instant of fictive darkness which followed the glare of the flashlight, Monsieur Thibault, the great conductor, disappeared forever from mortal sight, tail and all. Mrs. Culverin swears he was an international burglar and that she was just about to unmask him when he slipped away under cover of flashlight smoke, but no one else who sat at that historic dinner table believes her. No, there are no sound explanations, but Tommy thinks he knows, and he will never be able to pass a cat again without wondering. Mrs. Tommy is quite of her husband's mind regarding cats. She was Gretchen Woolwine of Chicago, for Tommy told her his whole story, and while she doesn't believe a great deal of it, there is no doubt in her heart that one person concerned in the affair was a perfect cat. Doubtless it would have been more romantic to relate how Tommy's darling finally won him his princess, but unfortunately it would not be veracious, for the Princess Vivaconarda also is with us no longer. Her nerves, shattered by the spectacular denouement of Mrs. Dingle's dinner, required a sea voyage, and from that voyage she has never returned to America. Of course, there are the usual stories. One hears of her, a nun in a Siamese convent, or a masked dancer at Le Jardin de Masser. One hears that she has been murdered in Patagonia or married in Trèsbizonde. But as far as can be ascertained, not one of these gaudy fables has the slightest basis of fact. I believe that Tommy, in his heart of hearts, is quite convinced that the sea voyage was only a pretext, and that by some unheard of means she had managed to rejoin the formidable Monsieur Thibault, wherever in the world of the visible or the invisible he may be. In fact, that in some ruined city or subterranean palace they reign together now, king and queen of all the mysterious kingdom of cats. But that, of course, is quite impossible.